After my husband died, my son and daughter-in-law betrayed me. I had nothing left. My company, my car, my mansion, all gone. That's when I started working as a cleaning lady for a billionaire who was about to lose everything. When I found a small, rusty key and gave it to him. Everything changed. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Judith, and at 62 years old, I discovered that the people you trust most can become your worst enemies in a single afternoon. It was exactly 3 months after my husband Robert's funeral when I found out what my son Seth and his wife Ever had been planning all along. I should have seen the signs, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way Ever's eyes would narrow whenever she looked at me, Seth's sudden interest in helping with the company paperwork after Robert's death. That Tuesday morning started like any other since I'd lost Robert. I woke up in our bedroom, my bedroom now, feeling that familiar weight in my chest, the emptiness that had become my constant companion. The house felt too big, too quiet without Robert's morning routine of coffee brewing and newspaper rustling downstairs. I was getting dressed when I heard voices in the kitchen. Seth and Ever had arrived early, which wasn't unusual since they'd been helping me manage Robert's affairs. But something in their tone made me pause at the top of the stairs. "The papers are all signed," Ever was saying, her voice carrying that sharp edge it always had when she thought she was being clever. "Your mother won't suspect anything until it's too late to change it." My blood went cold. I crept down the stairs, staying close to the wall where the old floorboards wouldn't creak. "Are you sure she can't fight this?" Seth asked. My own son, sounding worried not about me, but about getting caught. "Trust me," Ever replied with a laugh that made my skin crawl. "By the time she realizes what we've done, everything will be in your name. The company, this house, all of it. She'll be lucky if we let her stay in the guest room." I gripped the banister so hard, my knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. Not my Seth. Not the boy I'd raised, who I'd sacrificed everything for. "What about the life insurance money?" Seth asked. "Already transferred to our account yesterday. I told the bank you were handling all of your mother's finances now because of her emotional instability after losing Robert." The world tilted sideways. $25,000. That was my security, my safety net. Robert had worked extra shifts for years to pay those premiums, always telling me it would keep me comfortable if anything happened to him. I must have made a sound because suddenly the kitchen went quiet. "Mom?" Seth called out. "Is that you?" I had two choices, confront them now or pretend I hadn't heard anything and figure out what to do. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the railing, but I forced myself to walk into the kitchen with what I hoped looked like a normal smile. "Good morning, honey," I said to Seth, my voice surprisingly steady. "Ever." I nodded to my daughter-in-law, who was sitting at my kitchen table like she owned the place, which apparently she soon would. Ever's smile was predatory. "Judith, we were just talking about you. Seth has been so worried about how you're handling everything since Robert passed." The false concern in her voice made me sick. This was the same woman who had rolled her eyes whenever Robert talked about his work, who had made snide comments about our old-fashioned house, who had always made it clear she thought she was too good for our family. "That's sweet of him," I managed to say, watching Seth avoid my eyes. My own son couldn't even look at me while he was stealing my life away. "Actually, Mom, there are some papers we need you to sign," Seth said, pulling out a manila folder. "Just some legal stuff to make everything official with Dad's estate." I looked at the documents he spread across the table. They looked official enough, full of legal language I didn't understand. But now I knew what they really were, the final pieces of their plan to take everything Robert and I had built together. "I should probably have a lawyer look at these first," I said carefully. Ever's smile faltered for just a second. "Oh, that's not necessary. It's just standard paperwork. Besides, lawyers are so expensive, and you need to be careful with money now." The irony of her talking about my money she was planning to steal, was almost laughable. Almost. "I think I'll wait," I said, stepping back from the table. Maybe tomorrow. Seth's face darkened. Mom, you can't keep putting this off. Ever took time off work to help with this? The least you can do is cooperate. Ever had never worked a day in her life, as far as I knew. Her job seemed to be spending Seth's money and complaining about everything, but I just nodded. Of course, I appreciate all your help, both of you. They exchanged a look I pretended not to notice. After they left, promising to come back the next day, I sat at that kitchen table and felt my world crumble around me. I called Robert's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, who had been handling our affairs for years. When I explained what was happening, the silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. Judith, he finally said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like pity. I'm afraid there's something you need to know. Seth came to see me last week with documents showing he had power of attorney over your affairs. That's impossible. I never signed anything like that. Another pause. The signature looked authentic, and he had medical documentation stating you were suffering from severe depression and weren't capable of making financial decisions. The room started spinning. Medical documentation? From who? Dr. Morrison. Seth said you'd been seeing him since Robert's death. I'd never heard of Dr. Morrison in my life. But somehow, I had a feeling that if I tried to contact him, I'd find out that my signature was on his files too, probably right next to notes about my supposed mental instability. How much time do I have? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Judith. The papers were filed yesterday. As of this morning, Seth has legal control over all marital assets. The house, the business, everything is now in his name. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of the house that was no longer mine. 40 years of marriage, 35 years of building a business from nothing, a lifetime of love and sacrifice, gone. Stolen by the child I'd given everything to. That night, Seth and Ever came back. They didn't bother pretending anymore. We've decided you can stay in the guest room for now, Ever announced, walking through my living room like she was already redecorating it in her mind. But you'll need to follow some rules. I watched my son nod along with his wife's words, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. This wasn't the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, or the teenager who brought me coffee every morning before school. This was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize. What kind of rules? I heard myself ask. Ever's smile was ice-cold triumph. No visitors without permission, no access to the office or business files, and you'll contribute to household expenses, of course. How am I supposed to contribute? You've taken all my money. You'll figure something out, Seth said, speaking to me for the first time that day. Ever found a job listing that might work for you? Cleaning lady positions? The pay isn't much, but it's something. Standing there in the living room where Robert and I had celebrated 39 wedding anniversaries, where we'd taught Seth to walk and watched him graduate high school, I finally understood what complete betrayal felt like. It felt like drowning while the people you loved most watched from the shore. But as I looked at their satisfied faces, something hardened inside me. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken me completely. They had no idea what I was capable of when I had nothing left to lose. 3 weeks later, I stood outside the massive iron gates of the Blackwood estate, clutching a worn leather purse and trying to convince myself that this wasn't the end of my story, just a different chapter. The job interview had been humiliating enough. Sitting in the employment agency's cramped office, filling out applications for positions I'd never imagined needing, while women half my age looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. When was the last time you cleaned professionally, they'd asked. Never, I'd answered honestly. I'd been running a successful catering business with Robert for over 20 years, but desperation makes you swallow pride in ways you never thought possible. The Blackwood mansion loomed before me like something from another era, all dark stone and towering windows that seemed to watch everything with cold indifference. The agency had warned me that Mr. Richard Blackwood was, in their words, particular and difficult to please. What they hadn't mentioned was that he was a recluse who barely spoke to anyone, and whose previous cleaning staff had quit after less than a month. I pressed the buzzer at the service entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs. A voice crackled through the intercom, tired and rough around the edges. "You're the new cleaning lady?" "Yes, sir. Judith Harris." "Doors unlocked. Come in." The service entrance led into a kitchen that was larger than the entire first floor of the modest house Robert and I had started out in 42 years ago. Granite countertops stretched endlessly under hanging copper pots that looked like they'd never been used. Everything was spotless, but somehow felt abandoned, like a museum display of someone else's life. I followed the sound of footsteps down a hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced people in expensive clothes. The portraits seemed to judge me as I passed, and I found myself straightening my shoulders despite the weight of everything I'd lost. Richard Blackwood was standing in what I assumed was his study, his back to the door as he stared out a window overlooking grounds that probably cost more to maintain than most people made in a year. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his early 50s, with graying hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, and clothes that were expensive but wrinkled, like he'd slept in them. "Mr. Blackwood?" He turned, and I was struck by how tired he looked. Not just physically tired, but the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying weight you can't put down. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when they met mine, I saw something I recognized, the look of someone who'd lost more than they thought they could survive. "You're older than the others," he said without preamble, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "Yes, sir. I hope that won't be a problem." He studied me for a moment longer. "The agency said you're recently widowed. 3.5 months ago. I'm sorry for your loss." The words came automatically, but there was genuine sympathy in his voice. "My father passed 2 years ago. It's difficult." We stood there in awkward silence, two people who'd been hollowed out by loss and circumstance. I waited for him to tell me about my duties, about schedules and expectations, but instead he just gestured vaguely around the room. "I work from home mostly. I won't bother you if you don't bother me. Mrs. Chen will show you what needs to be done." Mrs. Chen turned out to be his housekeeper, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who walked me through the house with military efficiency. 23 rooms, she told me, though Mr. Blackwood only used about 5 of them regularly. The rest were kept clean but empty, like shrines to a life that used to exist here. "He's not a bad man," she said, as we climbed the main staircase, her voice softening slightly. "Just lost. Since his father died and the business troubles started, he barely leaves this house, barely eats. Some days I wonder if he even remembers I'm here." Business troubles. That explained the tiredness, the way his expensive clothes hung on him like he'd lost weight, the general air of a man fighting a battle he wasn't sure he could win. My first week was spent learning the rhythms of a house that felt more like a beautiful tomb than a home. Richard kept irregular hours, sometimes working in his study until 3 in the morning, other times disappearing for entire days into rooms I wasn't supposed to clean. When I did see him, he was always on the phone, his voice tense and clipped as he discussed things I didn't understand, board meetings and hostile takeovers and something called liquidation that made his jaw clench every time he said it. I found myself listening more carefully than I should have, partly out of curiosity, and partly because his obvious distress reminded me of how Robert used to sound during the worst days of our own business struggles. There was something familiar about watching a good person try to hold together something that was falling apart despite their best efforts. By the end of my second week, I'd established a routine. Early mornings in the kitchen, where I'd arrived to find evidence that Richard had been eating cereal for dinner again. A single bowl in the sink, a carton of milk left on the counter. The main living areas that gathered dust because no one ever used them. The library that was clearly his father's domain, filled with leather-bound books and photographs of Richard and an older man who had the same storm cloud eyes. It was in the library that I first noticed the gaps. I'd been dusting the shelves when I realized that several books were missing from what had obviously been complete sets. First editions of Dickens with Volume 3 absent. A collection of business biographies with random volumes gone. At first I thought maybe Richard had taken them to read, but when I asked Mrs. Chen about it, her face tightened. "He's been selling things," she said quietly. "First the artwork from the hallways, then some of the furniture from the unused bedrooms, now the books." She shook her head sadly. His father collected those for 40 years. Richard swore he'd never sell them, but desperation makes you do things you swore you'd never do. I knew that feeling intimately. That afternoon, I was cleaning Richard's study when he came in, phone pressed to his ear, pacing like a caged animal. I tried to work quietly, but his conversation was impossible to ignore. "I understand the terms of the loan," he was saying, his voice strained, "but I need more time. The company's restructuring plan is solid. I just need 60 more days to—" He stopped pacing, listening to whatever the person on the other end was saying. I watched his shoulders slump. "No, I can't provide additional collateral. There is no additional collateral." A pause. "Yes, I understand what happens if I default." He hung up without saying goodbye and stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hand like it was a weapon someone had just used against him. I should have left the room, should have given him privacy for whatever moment of despair he was clearly having. Instead, I found myself saying, "Mr. Blackwood, are you all right?" He looked up, seeming surprised to find me there. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, and I saw raw fear in his eyes. "I'm fine," he said automatically. Then, after a pause, "Actually, no, I'm not fine. But there's nothing anyone can do about it." I set down my cleaning cloth. "Sometimes talking helps." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to hear about my problems, Mrs. Harris? I'm about to lose everything my father spent his life building. The company, this house, 40 years of work, gone because I trusted the wrong people and made stupid decisions." The bitterness in his voice was so familiar it made my chest ache. "I know something about trusting the wrong people," I said quietly. Something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. "The agency said you were recently widowed." "My husband died 4 months ago. Within 3 weeks, my son and daughter-in-law had stolen everything we'd built together. Our business, our house, our life savings. I'm 62 years old, and I'm starting over with nothing because I trusted family more than lawyers." Richard's eyes widened. "Jesus, I'm sorry, that's devastating?" "Yes, it is." I picked up my cloth again, needing something to do with my hands. "But you know what I learned? Rock bottom is a solid place to build from." He was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "How do you do it? How do you keep going when everything falls apart?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "You find something worth fighting for, even if it's just the chance to prove that you're stronger than the people who tried to break you." That night, as I rode the bus home to my tiny studio apartment, the only place I could afford on my cleaning salary, I found myself thinking about Richard Blackwood. There was something about his situation that felt familiar beyond just the financial troubles. The way he moved through that enormous house like he was apologizing for taking up space. The careful way he spoke about his father, like he was afraid of disappointing a memory. I recognized the signs because I'd lived them. He wasn't just losing a business or a house. He was losing his identity, his sense of who he was supposed to be in the world. What I didn't know yet was that helping him find his way back would become the key to finding my own. It was on a gray Thursday morning, exactly 6 weeks into my employment at the Blackwood estate, when I found the key that would change everything. I'd arrived early that day, as had become my habit. The house felt less oppressive in the early morning light, and I'd grown to appreciate the quiet hour before Richard emerged from whatever restless sleep he managed to get. Mrs. Chen had mentioned the day before that she'd be visiting her sister in the city, so I knew I'd be alone with my thoughts and my cleaning routine. Richard had been having an especially difficult week. I'd overheard fragments of phone calls that painted a grim picture, something about final notices and foreclosure proceedings. The previous evening I'd found him in the library, sitting in his father's old leather chair with his head in his hands, surrounded by open books and scattered papers. He'd looked up when I entered, and the defeat in his eyes had made my heart clench. "I can't find it," he'd said, his voice hollow. 20 years I've been looking, and I can't find it." "Find what?" I'd asked, setting down my dustcloth. He gestured at the chaos around him. "Something my father hid. Something important. He used to tell me stories about it when I was young, but I thought they were just stories." He'd rubbed his eyes like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. Before he died, he kept insisting there was something in this library that would save the company. But he was so sick, so confused toward the end. I thought it was just the medication talking. I'd helped him gather the scattered books that night, noting how carefully he handled each one, how his fingers lingered on the pages like he was trying to absorb his father's memory through touch. Some of the volumes were clearly valuable first editions, the kind of books that belonged in museums rather than private libraries. Others were practical business texts, annotated in the margins with what I assumed was his father's handwriting. Now, in the morning light, I stood in that same library and decided to give it a thorough cleaning. Not just dusting, but the kind of deep cleaning that involved moving books and wiping down every surface. If Richard's father had hidden something here, maybe a fresh pair of eyes would spot what grief and desperation had missed. I started with the lower shelves, working methodically from left to right. Many of the books hadn't been moved in years, evidenced by the dust outlines on the shelves behind them. As I cleaned, I found myself reading the titles, getting a sense of the man who had collected them. Business strategy guides sat next to philosophy texts. Historical biographies were shelved alongside technical manuals about manufacturing and industry. It was when I reached a section of particularly old volumes that I noticed something odd. One book, a leather-bound copy of Industrial Revolution in America, felt different when I lifted it. Too light, somehow. The binding looked authentic, but when I opened it, I discovered why it felt wrong. The pages had been carefully cut out, leaving only the outer edges intact. Hidden in the hollow center was a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. Inside was an old brass key, tarnished with age but still solid. Attached to it with a thin chain was a small metal tag with a number engraved on it. 47. I stared at the key, my heart racing. This had to be what Richard's father had been talking about. But a key to what? I looked around the library with new eyes, searching for anything that might correspond to the number 47 or require a key to open. That's when I heard Richard's footsteps in the hallway. I quickly rewrapped the key and slipped it into my apron pocket, my mind racing. Should I tell him immediately? Part of me wanted to run to him with the discovery, to see the hope return to his eyes. But another part, the part that had learned to be cautious after everything Seth and Ever had done, wanted to understand what I'd found before I said anything. Richard appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day but looking like he'd barely slept. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosely knotted, and there was a 3-day stubble that suggested grooming had become less important than crisis management. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're here early." "I wanted to give the library a proper cleaning," I said, surprised by how normal my voice sounded despite the key burning like a secret in my pocket. "I hope you don't mind." He managed a weak smile. "Of course not. I appreciate everything you do." He paused, looking around the room with the same expression he'd worn the night before. "I don't suppose you've come across anything unusual while cleaning?" The key seemed to pulse against my leg through the fabric of my apron. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "What kind of unusual?" "I don't know. My father was always talking about contingencies, backup plans. He was paranoid about keeping all his eggs in one basket, as he put it." Richard walked to the window, staring out at the grounds that would soon belong to someone else. The last few months before he died, he kept insisting he'd left me something that would help if the business ever got into serious trouble. but I've torn this room apart looking for it. Maybe he didn't mean something in the room, I said carefully. Maybe he meant something the room would lead you to. Richard turned to look at me, a flicker of interest replacing some of the despair. What do you mean? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. I continued dusting, trying to appear casual while my thoughts raced. When my husband Robert was sick, he started leaving me notes in strange places. Not just love notes, but practical things. Reminders about where he kept important papers, which bills were due when. I found them for months after he died, tucked into books I rarely opened, taped under drawers I seldom used. You think my father might have done something like that? I think fathers who love their children find ways to take care of them, even after they're gone. Richard was quiet for a long time after that, but I could practically hear his mind working. After he left for another round of phone calls that would probably bring more bad news, I allowed myself to really examine the key. It was old, definitely. The brass had the kind of patina that only comes with decades of age. The number 47 was hand-engraved, not machine-stamped, suggesting it was custom-made. But most interesting was the shape. This wasn't a house key or even a typical safe key. The head was too elaborate, the shaft too ornate. This was the kind of key you'd see in old movies, the kind that opened something important. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning with half my attention while the other half tried to solve the puzzle. Where in a house this size would you find something marked with the number 47? Room numbers? Safe deposit boxes? Storage units? It wasn't until I was cleaning the master bedroom, Richard's father's old room, which Richard couldn't bring himself to occupy, that I found the first clue. The room was like a shrine to a different era. Heavy wooden furniture, oil paintings of landscapes that probably cost more than most cars, and a massive 4-poster bed that dominated the space. But it was the writing desk in the corner that caught my attention. It was an antique piece, beautiful but practical, with multiple small drawers and compartments. As I dusted it, I noticed that each drawer had a small brass number plate. Most were numbered in sequence, 1, 2, 3, but there were gaps. And when I looked more carefully, I realized that some of the number plates had been removed, leaving small holes where they'd been screwed in. My pulse quickened. I examined every drawer, every compartment, looking for the number 47. It wasn't there. But in the bottom right corner, I found something else, a small keyhole that didn't correspond to any of the visible drawers. I looked around the room more carefully. If there was a hidden compartment in the desk, there might be others. I ran my hands along the walls, checking for hollow sounds or loose panels. I examined the baseboards, looking for anything that seemed out of place. It was pure chance that I noticed the fireplace mantel. The mantel itself was carved marble, elaborate and expensive. But as I cleaned it, I realized that one section, a decorative panel about 2 feet from the left end, felt slightly different, smoother. And when I looked closely, I could see the faintest outline of what might be a hidden panel. I pressed gently, then harder. Nothing. I tried sliding it sideways, then pulling it toward me. Still nothing. It wasn't until I noticed a small depression in the carving, so subtle it looked like natural variation in the stone, that I found the mechanism. When I pressed the depression, I heard a quiet click. The panel slid aside, revealing a small cavity behind it. And inside that cavity was a brass plate with the number 47 engraved on it, and a keyhole that looked like it would match the key in my pocket perfectly. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the hidden keyhole and trying to process what I'd discovered. This wasn't just some family heirloom or sentimental keepsake. Richard's father had gone to elaborate lengths to hide this, whatever it was. The fake book, the hidden panel, the custom key. This was the work of a man who understood that sometimes the most important things needed to be protected from everyone, even the people you trusted most. The sound of Richard's voice in the hallway made me quickly slide the panel back into place. Whatever was behind that keyhole, whatever Richard's father had hidden there, I needed to think carefully about when and how to reveal it. Because something told me that what I'd found was going to change everything, And after what Seth and Ever had done to me, I'd learned that some changes, even good ones, needed to be handled very, very carefully. I couldn't sleep that night. The keys seemed to burn in my purse beside my bed, and my mind wouldn't stop racing with possibilities and fears. What if I was wrong? What if this was just some old family trinket and I was building it up into something it wasn't? But what if I was right, and this key opened something that could save Richard from losing everything his father had built? By 5 a.m, I'd given up on sleep entirely. I made coffee in my tiny kitchenette and sat at my small table, watching the sun rise over a city that suddenly felt full of possibilities again. For the first time since Robert's death, since Seth and Ever's betrayal, I felt like I might have some power to change someone's story for the better. I arrived at the Blackwood estate an hour early, my hands shaking slightly as I let myself in through the service entrance. The house was completely quiet. Even Mrs. Chen wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. Perfect. I made my way to the master bedroom, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs that probably cost more than I'd earn in 5 years of cleaning. The morning light streaming through the tall windows made the room feel less like a shrine and more like a place where important things happened. I found the hidden panel on the mantel immediately now that I knew where to look. The small depression, the way it clicked when pressed just right. The brass plate with 47 engraved on it gleamed in the morning light, and the keyhole seemed to be waiting patiently for me to make my decision. I pulled the key from my pocket, unwrapped it carefully, and held it up to the light. It was definitely the right size, the right style. My heart hammered against my ribs as I inserted it into the lock. It fit perfectly. And when I turned it, I heard the soft click of a mechanism that had been waiting 20 years to be activated. A section of the mantel, larger than I'd expected, swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a compartment about the size of a large book. Inside was a metal document box, the kind you'd use for really important papers, and a manila envelope thick with contents I couldn't guess at. I lifted out the document box first. It was heavier than I'd expected, and I could hear papers shifting inside. There was a combination lock on it, but when I tried to open it, I discovered it wasn't locked. Richard's father had trusted that hiding it would be security enough. Inside were documents, lots of them. The first thing I saw was a business contract, dated 23 years ago, between Blackwood Industries and Harris Catering Services. My breath caught in my throat. Harris Catering Services. That was my business, mine and Robert's. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the contract and read it carefully. It was a partnership agreement, not just a catering contract, but an actual business partnership. Robert's signature was at the bottom, alongside that of Richard's father, Edmund Blackwood. According to the document, Robert had provided startup capital for a major expansion of Blackwood Industries back when Richard was still in college. In return, he'd been given a 25% stake in the company and a seat on the board of directors. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Robert had never mentioned this, never said a word about being part owner of a major corporation. But as I read further, I began to understand why. The next document was a letter, written in Robert's familiar handwriting. "Edmund," it began, "I've thought carefully about your offer to buy out my stake in the company. While the money would be helpful for expanding Harris Catering, I think the partnership has been more valuable than either of us anticipated. However, I'm willing to consider a modified arrangement. Instead of selling my shares, I propose we place them in trust for your son Richard, to be transferred to him when he turns 30 or when you retire, whichever comes first. In exchange, you continue the quarterly profit-sharing payments to Harris Catering, but increase them by 15% to account for my foregone ownership rights. This way, Richard inherits a fully consolidated company, and Judith and I maintain our financial partnership with Blackwood Industries without the complications of active ownership. I trust you'll find this arrangement satisfactory." The letter was dated 15 years ago. I quickly calculated. Richard would have been 35 then, well past the age when the shares should have transferred to him. I kept reading, finding more documents that painted a picture I'd never imagined. Financial statements showing regular payments from Blackwood Industries to Harris Catering Services. Payments that had continued right up until 6 months ago, just before Robert's death. Business correspondence between Robert and Edmund discussing expansion plans, investment strategies, even personal matters about their children and marriages. They hadn't just been business partners, they'd been friends. But the most shocking document was at the bottom of the box. It was a copy of a stock transfer, dated just 2 months before Edmund Blackwood's death, officially transferring the 25% stake in Blackwood Industries to Richard, as Robert had requested years earlier. According to these papers, Richard owned a quarter of his own father's company and didn't even know it. I sat back on my heels, trying to process what I'd discovered. If Richard owned 25% of Blackwood Industries, then whoever was trying to take the company away from him was essentially stealing from him twice over. But more than that, they were stealing from Robert's legacy, and from me. Because if Robert owned those shares when he died, and if Seth had used fraudulent documents to steal everything Robert owned, then Seth currently held stock certificates worth. I couldn't even estimate. Millions, probably. My hands shook as I opened the manila envelope. Inside were more documents, copies of everything in the box, plus bank statements, investment records, and a detailed breakdown of exactly how much money Blackwood Industries had paid to Harris Catering Services over the years. The total was staggering. Over 2 decades, Robert and I had received nearly $800,000 from our partnership with Blackwood Industries. Money that I'd always assumed came from our catering contracts, but which had actually been profit-sharing from Robert's ownership stake. At the very bottom of the envelope was one final letter, this one addressed to me personally. Judith, it read in Edmund Blackwood's careful script. If you're reading this, then something has happened to both Robert and myself, and my son Richard is likely facing the greatest crisis of his life. The documents in this box represent not just a business partnership, but a friendship that sustained both our families through good times and difficult ones. Robert never wanted you to know about the ownership stake because he worried you'd feel obligated to be involved in business decisions you had no interest in making. But he also never wanted you to be left without security if something happened to him. The shares that now belong to Richard are worth substantially more than Robert's original investment. But more importantly, they represent a bond between our families that I hope will continue into the next generation. Richard is a good man, but he's never had to fight for anything the way Robert and I did when we were building our businesses from nothing. If he's in trouble, and if you're in a position to help him understand what he truly owns, I hope you'll consider it an honor to help Robert's memory protect my son the way Robert protected me all those years ago. With great respect and gratitude, Edmund Blackwood. I read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Richard wasn't just losing his father's business, he was losing a business that was partially mine. And Seth, by stealing my inheritance, had stolen something that could save the man who'd been paying my bills for 20 years without either of us knowing it. The irony was almost overwhelming. The son who had betrayed me held the key to saving the man whose family had been supporting mine for decades. And I was the only one who knew the truth. I carefully replaced all the documents in the box and envelope, then locked the hidden compartment. But I didn't return the key to its hiding place in the hollow book. Instead, I slipped it back into my pocket. I had some thinking to do. When Richard finally emerged from his room that morning, he looked worse than I'd seen him yet. His phone had been ringing constantly since 7, and from the fragments of conversation I'd overheard, the news wasn't good. Mrs. Harris, he said when he found me in the kitchen, I need to ask you a favor. Of course. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. I may not be able to pay your salary next week. The bank is accelerating some deadlines. I understand if you need to find other employment. I looked at this man who had no idea he owned a quarter of his own company, who was about to lose everything because he didn't know what his father and my husband had built together, and I made my decision. Mr. Blackwood, I said carefully, before you make any final arrangements with the bank, there's something I need to show you. The hope that flickered in his eyes was almost painful to see. What do you mean? I pulled the key from my pocket and set it on the kitchen counter between us. Your father did leave you something, and I think it's exactly what you've been looking for. He stared at the key for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You found it? Where? In a book in the library, but Mr. Blackwood. Richard, this is bigger than you think it is. Much bigger. And as I led him upstairs to show him what his father had hidden all those years ago, I realized that finding that key had changed more than just Richard's future. It had given me a chance to rewrite my own. Richard's face went through a series of emotions as I showed him the hidden compartment and its contents. First disbelief, then recognition, then something that looked like grief mixed with anger. 25%, he said quietly, holding the stock certificates with hands that trembled slightly. I own a quarter of my own company and had no idea. Your father and my husband were protecting you both, I said, sitting beside him on the antique chair in the master bedroom. Robert never wanted me to feel burdened by business decisions. Your father wanted to make sure you inherited a unified company. Richard looked up from the documents, his storm-gray eyes focusing on me with new intensity. Your husband, Robert, Harris Catering Services. You said your son stole your business. Everything. The company, the house, all our savings, even the life insurance money. The familiar pain twisted in my chest, but for the first time it was accompanied by something else. Hope. But according to these papers, Seth didn't just steal from me, he stole from you too. How do you mean? I pulled out the bank statements that showed the quarterly payments from Blackwood Industries to Harris Catering. For 20 years, your company has been paying mine profit-sharing money. Robert owned those shares when he died, which means legally they should have come to me. But Seth used forged documents to take everything in Robert's name. Richard's jaw clenched as he understood the implications. So your son currently holds stock certificates that belong to you, which represent ownership in my company. Stock certificates that could save Blackwood Industries from being taken over. And that he has no legal right to possess. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Finally, Richard spoke. Mrs. Harris, Judith, I need to ask you something, and please be honest with me. When you found this key, when you figured out what it opened, why didn't you just take these documents to a lawyer and claim what was rightfully yours? You could have walked away from all of this. I considered his question carefully, because walking away is what I did wrong the first time. When Seth and Ever started their manipulation, when I sensed something was off but convinced myself I was being paranoid, I walked away from my own instincts. I let them isolate me, make me doubt myself. I met his eyes. I'm not walking away anymore, even though helping me means confronting your son? Especially because of that. Richard stood and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds that might soon belong to strangers. There's something I need to tell you. About the people who are trying to take over Blackwood Industries. What about them? The primary investor, the one who's been buying up debt and pressuring the bank to foreclose. His name is Marcus Webb, but he's working with a shell company called Evergreen Holdings. My blood went cold. Evergreen Holdings? You know it? Ever. My daughter-in-law's name is Ever. She always said she was going to name her business Evergreen something when she got around to starting one. My mind raced through the implications. Richard, I think Seth and Ever aren't just thieves. I think they're part of the group trying to destroy your company. Richard turned from the window, his face pale. That's not possible. How would they even know about Blackwood Industries? Through the financial statements they stole from Robert's files. They would have seen the quarterly payments, seen how much money was coming from your company. Even if they didn't understand the ownership structure, they'd know there was a connection. So they steal your husband's shares, then use their knowledge of the company's financial situation to help orchestrate a takeover. Richard's voice was tight with controlled fury. They profit twice, once from stealing your inheritance and again from destroying my family's business. It's worse than that, I said, pieces clicking into place in my mind. If they succeed in taking over Blackwood Industries, they'll own the company that's been making payments to Harris Catering Services. They'll effectively own both sides of the partnership your father and Robert built. Richard was quiet for a long time, but I could practically hear his mind working. Finally, he spoke. "Judith, I'm going to make you an offer. But before I do, I want you to know that you don't owe me anything. You could take these documents to a lawyer tomorrow, prove that your son stole property that wasn't his to take, and claim the shares that rightfully belong to you. You'd be a wealthy woman, and you'd never have to work as a cleaning lady again. But if you're willing to work with me, if you're willing to be my partner in this fight, I think we can do more than just recover what was stolen. I think we can make sure your son and daughter-in-law pay for what they've done to both our families." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the desperation that might make him promise things he couldn't deliver. But what I saw was something else entirely. Determination. The kind of focused anger that comes when someone finally understands exactly who their enemies are and what they're fighting for. What kind of partnership? The kind your husband and my father had, built on trust, mutual respect, and shared goals. Richard pulled out his phone. "First, I call my lawyer and explain what we've discovered. Then we file injunctions to freeze any assets your son obtained through fraud. Then we go after Evergreen Holdings and Marcus Webb. And if we win—" "When we win," Richard corrected, "you'll have your life back, your business, your financial security, your dignity, everything they took from you." "What about you?" Richard's smile was sharp as a blade. "I'll have my company back, and more importantly, I'll have honored the partnership my father valued more than anything except his family." That afternoon, Richard's lawyer, James Morrison, arrived at the estate with a briefcase full of legal documents and an expression of barely contained excitement. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke in careful, measured sentences that made every word sound like it had been weighed and found worthy. "This is extraordinary," he said after reviewing the documents from the hidden compartment. "Mrs. Harris, you have grounds for multiple lawsuits: fraud, theft, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty. The criminal charges alone could send your son to prison for years." "I'm not interested in sending Seth to prison," I said, surprising both men. "I'm interested in getting back what he stole and making sure he can't hurt anyone else." "That's certainly possible," Morrison said. "But Mrs. Harris, I need you to understand something. Fighting this kind of case can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. Are you prepared for what your son and daughter-in-law might do when they realize what you're threatening to take away from them?" I thought about Seth's face when he told me I'd be lucky if they let me stay in the guest room of my own house. I thought about Ever's cold satisfaction as she outlined the rules I'd have to follow to remain in their good graces. I thought about the months I'd spent working as a cleaning lady, believing I was alone in the world with nothing left to fight for. "Mr. Morrison," I said calmly, "they already did the worst thing they could do to me. They made me believe I was powerless. Now I know better." Richard leaned forward in his chair. "James, how quickly can we move on this?" "With evidence this solid, very quickly. I can have injunctions filed by tomorrow morning to freeze assets obtained through fraudulent means. That will prevent them from selling or transferring anything while we build our case." "What about Evergreen Holdings?" Morrison's expression grew predatory. "If we can prove that your son and daughter-in-law are connected to the company that's been orchestrating the takeover of Blackwood Industries, we can add conspiracy charges to the list. Corporate espionage, insider trading, racketeering. The penalties for that kind of coordinated fraud are severe." "How severe?" I asked. "Complete asset forfeiture, criminal charges that could result in decades of prison time, and civil penalties that would ensure they never financially recover from what they've done." I felt a strange sort of calm settle over me. Not the peace of forgiveness, but the clarity that comes when you finally see the path forward after months of stumbling in the dark. "Do it," I said. "All of it." Richard reached over and squeezed my hand. Are you sure? I looked around the master bedroom where Richard's father had carefully hidden the proof of a 20-year friendship, where he'd trusted that someday the truth would be discovered by someone who would use it to protect the people he loved. Your father and my husband built something beautiful together, I said. They created a partnership based on trust and mutual respect. Seth and Ever tried to destroy that, tried to profit from betraying everything Robert and I worked for. I met Richard's eyes. It's time to show them what happens when you underestimate the people you've wronged. As Morrison left to begin filing legal documents that would turn my son's world upside down, Richard and I sat in the library where this had all begun. The hollow book was back on the shelf, but now it felt less like a hiding place and more like a treasure chest that had finally yielded its secrets. Judith, Richard said quietly, I want you to know something. Even if we recover everything that was stolen, even if we save Blackwood Industries and send your son to prison, I don't want you to go back to working as a cleaning lady. What do you mean? I mean you belong here, not as an employee, but as a partner, the way it should have been all along. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, and tomorrow Seth and Ever were going to learn that the woman they'd tried to break was about to break them instead. The phone call came at exactly 9:15 in the morning, 3 days after Morrison had filed our injunctions. I was in Richard's study, helping him review financial projections for Blackwood Industries' recovery, when his lawyer called with news that made us both smile for the first time in weeks. The assets have been frozen, Morrison reported, his voice carrying a satisfaction that was almost musical. Your son's bank accounts, the business accounts for Harris Catering Services, even his personal property. Everything obtained through fraudulent documentation is now under court protection pending resolution of the case. What was his reaction? Richard asked. Panic, from what I understand. His lawyer called my office 6 times yesterday trying to negotiate a settlement. Apparently, Mr. Seth Harris is very eager to avoid criminal charges. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and vindication. This was my son, the little boy I'd raised, who was now learning what it felt like to have everything stripped away in a single morning. But he'd made his choices, just as I was making mine. What about Ever and Evergreen Holdings? I asked. That's where things get interesting, Morrison continued. When we filed documents requesting disclosure of Evergreen Holdings' ownership structure, they immediately tried to dissolve the company and transfer assets offshore. Fortunately, we anticipated that move and had already requested freezing orders for any subsidiary companies. Richard leaned back in his chair, a predatory smile playing at his lips. So they're trapped. Completely. And Mrs. Harris, you'll be interested to know that when we executed search warrants on Evergreen Holdings offices, we found extensive files on Blackwood Industries dating back 2 years. Financial records, internal memos, strategic plans. Your daughter-in-law has been planning this takeover for much longer than we originally thought. The implications sent a chill through me. Ever hadn't just opportunistically stolen from Robert's estate. She'd been researching and planning an elaborate scheme to destroy Richard's family business while simultaneously robbing mine. How did she know so much about Blackwood Industries? I asked. According to the documents we recovered, she hired a private investigator to research all of your husband's business connections after his diagnosis with cancer. She's been planning this since before he died, Mrs. Harris. The inheritance theft was just the first step in a much larger scheme. I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of Ever's calculated cruelty. She hadn't just stolen from a grieving widow. She'd been preparing to destroy 2 families while Robert was still alive, still fighting for his life. Where does this leave us legally? Richard asked. In an extraordinarily strong position. We have proof of fraud, conspiracy, theft, and attempted corporate espionage. The prosecution is prepared to offer plea agreements, but frankly, I don't think we need to negotiate. 2 weeks later, I stood in a courtroom watching my son try to explain to a federal judge how he'd obtained legal authority over assets he'd never been entitled to inherit. Seth looked smaller somehow, diminished in his expensive suit that he could no longer afford. Ever sat beside him, her usual arrogant confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. Their lawyer, a overpriced specialist in white-collar crime, was making a valiant effort to paint them as naive victims who'd been misled by bad legal advice. But Morrison had done his work well. Every document they'd forged, every signature they'd faked, every lie they'd told was laid out in excruciating detail. "Your Honor," Morrison addressed the court, "this was not a case of poor judgment or unfortunate misunderstanding. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme to defraud Mrs. Harris of her rightful inheritance while simultaneously destroying a family business that had supported her for over 20 years. The judge, an older woman with steel-gray hair and no patience for elaborate excuses, reviewed the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human greed. "Mr. Harris," she finally said, addressing Seth directly, "do you have anything to say before I render my decision?" Seth stood slowly, his hands visibly shaking. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might finally show some recognition of what he'd done to his own mother. Instead, he said, "Your Honor, I was only trying to protect my family's future." The words hit me like a physical blow. Even now, even facing the complete destruction of everything he'd stolen, Seth couldn't acknowledge that I was his family too. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Harris, you weren't protecting your family. You were destroying it." The final judgment was swift and comprehensive. Complete restitution of all stolen assets, including Harris Catering Services, the house, and the $25,000 in life insurance money. Criminal charges that would result in 18 months in federal prison for Seth and 2 years forever, who had been determined to be the primary architect of the scheme. And civil penalties that included the dissolution of Evergreen Holdings and the return of all assets to Blackwood Industries. But perhaps most importantly, the court officially recognized my ownership of the 25% stake in Blackwood Industries that Robert had held at the time of his death. As Seth and Ever were led away in handcuffs, a sight that should have brought me satisfaction but instead just felt like the end of a very long, very painful chapter, Richard and I walked out of the courthouse into brilliant autumn sunlight. "How do you feel?" he asked as we reached his car. I considered the question seriously. "Empty," I said finally, "but not in a bad way. Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I forgot what it felt like to stand up straight." Richard nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who'd been through their own betrayal could. "What do you want to do now?" "I want to go home," I said. Then I realized what I'd said and laughed, except I'm not sure where that is anymore. "I have an idea about that," Richard said, starting the car, "if you're interested." 3 months later, I stood in the renovated offices of Harris Blackwood Industries, looking out at the San Francisco skyline and marveling at how much my life had changed. The company nameplate on my desk read, "Judith Harris, Vice President of Operations," a title that reflected my new role as Richard's equal partner in running the business our husbands had built together. Richard had insisted on the partnership restructuring, despite my protests that I hadn't contributed nearly as much as his father or mine had over the years. "You found the key," he'd said simply. "Without you, none of this would have been possible. Besides, this is what our fathers would have wanted." He was right. The documents from Edmund's hidden compartment had included detailed plans for exactly this kind of partnership structure, carefully thought-out provisions for bringing family members into the business as equal partners rather than junior employees. Harris Catering Services had been fully restored and was now operating as a subsidiary of the larger company, providing corporate catering services to clients throughout the Bay Area. The house that Seth and Ever had stolen was mine again, though I'd decided to sell it and use the money to buy a smaller place closer to the office. Mrs. Chen had been promoted to head of household management for the Blackwood estate, a position that came with a substantial salary increase and the kind of respect she'd always deserved. And Richard had moved out of his father's bedroom and into the master suite, finally ready to claim his place as the head of his family's legacy. But perhaps the most surprising change was personal. Richard and I had discovered that the partnership our husbands had built wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Two families who had supported each other through decades of challenges, who had trusted each other with their most important decisions, who had created something beautiful together. "Any regrets?" Richard asked, joining me at the office window with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual we'd established during the long weeks of rebuilding the company. "About Seth and Ever?" I shook my head. "They made their choices. I can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." "That's not what I meant." I looked at him, this man who had become not just my business partner, but my closest friend. "What did you mean?" "I meant about everything. Walking away from cleaning houses, taking on all this responsibility, dealing with lawyers and board meetings and corporate politics." I smiled, thinking about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, broken, isolated, convinced that her life was over at 62. "Richard, 6 months ago I thought I had nothing left to live for. I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life paying for mistakes I didn't make, suffering for trusting people I should have been able to trust. And now I know better. Now I know that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to rebuild yourself into something stronger." Richard raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To second chances." "To partnerships," I corrected, clinking my cup against his. "The kind that last." Through the office window, I could see the San Francisco Bay stretching out toward the horizon, full of possibilities I was just beginning to imagine. Somewhere in the city below, Seth was serving his sentence and learning what it meant to lose everything you thought was yours. Ever was doing the same, probably plotting her next scheme, and never understanding that her real mistake hadn't been getting caught. It had been underestimating the people she'd tried to break. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. I was thinking about Robert, and how proud he'd be to see that the partnership he'd built with Edmund Blackwood had survived and flourished despite every attempt to destroy it. I was thinking about the key I'd found in a hollow book, and how sometimes the most important discoveries come when you're not looking for treasure, but just trying to clean up someone else's mess. And I was thinking about the future, a future where being 62 years old didn't mean being discarded, where losing everything didn't have to mean the end of your story, where trust betrayed could eventually be rebuilt into something even stronger. The woman who had walked into the Blackwood estate 7 months ago with nothing but a desperate need for work was gone. In her place was someone I was still getting to know, someone who owned a thriving business, who had a voice in boardroom decisions, who had learned that the best revenge wasn't hurting the people who hurt you. The best revenge was building something so beautiful, so strong, so lasting that their attempts to destroy you became nothing more than footnotes in the story of everything you accomplished afterward. Outside the window, the sun was setting over the bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chapters in the story that had started with a rusty key and a leap of faith. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was looking forward to finding out what came next. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.